Pat McGorry and John Cain probably need no introduction. Pat is Australia's leading mental health expert, especially on youth mental health. Senior academic professor at Melbourne University, advises state and federal governments and has done for many years, former Australian of the Year, and has been a leading voice, I think, during the pandemic about the effects of mental health caused by the pandemic. John Cain is the state's coroner, but before that has had a very eminent legal career in Victoria. I think what's both unique about John and Patrick is that both not only have a sense through their current jobs about the mental and health impacts of the pandemic, but have an acute sense of the politics behind the mental health debate, both at a state and federal level. And I'd encourage both of our speakers to give frank and fearless discussion about some of the political plays going on and political pressures that impact what's happening in Victoria. So enough of me. I'd like to just open it up to both of you initially, and I'll start with Patrick. It's been a hell of a year, thanks to the pandemic. The impacts of mental health we all intuitively believe would be immense. Some of the stats, though, aren't clear. And of course, I suspect it's going to be a hell of a year to come, and we're going to see far more, I think, telling consequences from the pandemic. So I'll pick up on something, Pat, you said earlier this year. I think there'll be a lingering mental health effect of the lockdown. There's a risk of scarring a whole generation. If you can just take us through what you mean by that, what you've seen and what you expect yet to come.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and thanks for the opportunity to be part of this terrific discussion today to the Press Club. And yeah, look, the Economist magazine calls it the shadow pandemic, the mental health impact of the pandemic itself. And obviously in different parts of the world it's going to be different because there's been a lot more death and destruction in the Northern Hemisphere, so there'll be more trauma and loss associated there. But here, even here, despite our success, we've already seen a surge in mental ill health. We modelled this and predicted it back in May, and it's really hitting, but systems not really fit for purpose to deal with it. But there's a broader issue, which I think every Victorian could probably relate to, which is the issue of morale. This was an amazing book written in the 1940s during the Blitz in the UK, in London, and it was a beautiful analysis of how morale in a society is created and maintained or lost. So that also taps into the idea of well-being. And I think every single Victorian would have experienced a loss of well-being, a loss of positive mental health during the pandemic. But that comes back relatively quickly, I think, and we're already seeing that. But what doesn't come back is the exposed vulnerability that 50% of us have within the society to periods of mental ill health. At least 50% of us will have periods of mental ill health across our lives. And when you experience this kind of major event and series of disasters like we've just been through, that's going to get exposed, and you can model it. And the prediction is, maybe around 30% of increase of need for care, for professional help, on top of what was already the case. And as you know, and everyone involved here knows, we were in dire straits before the pandemic in terms of responding to even the existing level of need and the rising tide of suicide that was happening up until the latest figures last year. So we already had a very serious neglected public health problem, and now we've got an extra wave of need on top of that, which is, as you say, according to the modelling, is going to endure into next year and beyond, driven a lot by social and economic factors. So if the economy does recover strongly, then probably less of an impact, but certainly I think a lingering tail, as you've said, and there are data to support that. Even the acute surveys that have been done during the pandemic, there's one that Headspace did on 3,500 young people, showing that 75% of them described their mental health as significantly worse during the pandemic than previously. For obvious reasons, the disruption educationally and loss of employment and the threats to their future, the cloud over their future, which seems like climate change also contribute to. So yeah, a bit of a perfect storm, I'm afraid.
John, I think you're unique compared to your predecessors in that for the first time you've sought to release suicide data, although there was an interesting figure you released in the middle of this year that showed, despite all the warnings about an increase in suicide, there were fewer suicides up until August, between January 1 and August this year, than on the previous year's figures. What does that tell us about mental health, the impact of the pandemic, and have those figures drastically altered in the next 6 months?
Nick, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to the Press Club today, and congratulations to the Press Club for putting this issue on its agenda. Look, I'll start with a bit of background. I started this role 12 months ago, and one of the things that I was most surprised about when I came into the job were that of the 7,000 reportable deaths each year, over 700 of those were suicides. So 10% of reportable deaths in this state are as a result of people taking their own lives. And what also became clear is that the significant impact of each one of those deaths, there is a family sitting behind it, or sitting behind them, and they're all adversely affected by that. As we moved into particularly the second wave of the second lockdown, there was a lot of debate and discussion around the increased suicide risk. And what became clear to us at the court was that there was an absence of real-time information about that. So the debate wasn't as well informed as it could have been. So that's why we took the decision in August to publish data that we collect, and data that we've been collecting consistently for over a 20-year period, and to publish that. Now, to focus on your particular question, the situation as at the end of November is that the suicide figures this year are largely consistent with the figures last year. So there hasn't been a spike and there hasn't been a dramatic increase. Now, that's terrific in the sense that we haven't seen that large jump. I'm still very troubled by the 700 number in itself, but we haven't seen an increase this year. But that's, I think, can be attributed in part to significant work that has been done by those supporting people who have mental health issues and suicidal ideation. And the ability to keep those numbers at current levels is probably a function of managing people's ongoing mental health and making sure that there are resources available as and when required to help people in need.
A question, Pat, from one of our health reporters in Victoria. I'm not sure about the stats here, but they've written 13 young males under 18 suicided before September 30 this year, which is approximately equal to the full year frequency for this group in earlier years. Are you concerned there is going to be a big leap in young people suiciding? Are they concerned about young boys suiciding in particular? We've already seen self-harm incidents and eating disorders among young people soar this year too.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are definitely differential effects within the overall data, and John might like to comment on this too. But I think we saw a 46% increase. This is national data, I think. This is going back pre-pandemic in young women, actually. As you say, mostly it's young men who die from suicide in that age group, the emerging adult age group, teenagers and young adults, especially the 18 to 24-year-olds. That's where I think it was an 11% increase between 2018 and 2019 nationally, and 46% increase amongst the young women, which was like a smaller group. But the trends are very important too. And you mentioned eating disorders. You mentioned, I think there are a number of other conditions that have worsened in the pandemic as well. We've got some data, but I think John's point, you mentioned Are You OK Day, and I think with suicide, there's probably like a split. There's a number of people, maybe up to 50%, that don't reach out, at the point, that they need help. So that's why encouraging people to talk to someone they trust and then, have that as a stepping stone to professional help. That's one group that we need to target from a prevention point of view that he mentioned. But then the group that I'm much more in contact with are the ones that desperately try to seek help, often repeatedly in young people and older groups too, but cannot get it. They just get turned away. a lot of the providers' books are closed. The public mental health system is about, let's say, about a third the size of what it needs to be in Victoria. And every single day I hear horror stories. People bring me up all the time, as you can imagine, in a distressed way. And I hear horror stories from my friends that work in emergency departments and other places where people are turned away after repeated attempts to get help. The system cannot actually admit them, even though it might want to, and they die, preventable deaths, almost daily, I would say, around the country. The final common pathway is, can the person get the right sort of safety net and help, and will they actually turn to reach out for it at that point? So that's where I think we're not doing a very good job in Australia, probably a worse job than in some other high-income countries in some senses. That might be a partial explanation. Another clue to that is that in rural and regional Australia, where services are much more thin on the ground, the rates are higher. So I think we've got to think, what feasibly can we do in the short to medium term? We probably can't turn around the huge sort of engines of geopolitical, influence in terms of economies and world politics, and inequality across the world. That's another thing, and climate change, these sort of things. But what we can do is actually care for the people who are actually, in that very serious red zone near the edge of the cliff.
Speaking of safety nets, obviously there's been some welfare type programs to give people financial support. Some of these will be winding down in coming months. I think there's a sense in the community that things could go very poorly. People look to the housing market and of course also to mental health. Are you expecting mental health or potentially to jump off a cliff? A terrible expression perhaps, but when JobKeeper, these sorts of things are wound down, people really start feeling the pinch. Is that a pressing concern?
Well, this is where Ian's Hickey's modelling is key, because maybe one of the reasons we haven't seen the rise yet is because there have been those safety nets to some extent, and I think we are worried about that. Ian's modelling is done in a part of Australia that I'm actually in at the moment, the mid to far north coast of New South Wales, and that's a very sort of regional area with a lot of unemployment, a lot of disadvantage, a lot of Indigenous populations, and the young people in that area. It was focused on young people, his modelling, and the most powerful variables affecting the risk of suicide are economic, as you say, employment, educational completion, those sorts of variables. And the only things that can really moderate that, apart from just the economy sort of being, the economic safety nets being there, are the provision of services, which are, so they put all these different things into the model as to what could moderate the level. And depending on what's actually done now, economically and service-wise, you can actually probably prevent most of it, but you've got to act.
The findings of our work at the court show that the main contributing factors are family breakdown, financial stress, whether that's unemployment or business failure or no prospect of employment, interactions with the justice system, and isolation and loneliness. So the four, across all age groups and sectors, they're the four contributing factors. The issue with this pandemic is that it is an overlay on each one of those. So it is a compounding factor for each one. So as you talk about when those safety nets are removed or things happen, then I guess what we do, we're looking at it in the context of, well, how is it going to impact on each of those four factors? And the chances are it will impact on each of them. And the access to services and the ability to intervene in a way so as to prevent death is the critical task.
John, if you could highlight one policy failing you've seen in common with some or many of the suicides your court has looked at, one policy failing, one key area of change you'd be advocating for, what would it be?
There'll always be a debate about whether there's enough resources or not, but leaving that part of it aside, it's a patchwork. So it's hard to navigate. You don't necessarily, if you're a parent with a troubled child, or you've got a family member there, it's not immediately obvious what the pathway and the steps are to get help. So you end up or more often than not, you can end up in a casualty at a public hospital, and the very nature of casualties is that they're there to fix a quick, immediate problem, and then you're referred off somewhere else. So I guess there's confusion and lack of understanding in the community because of that patchwork of services. It needs to be a consistent, easy to navigate system so that people aren't left confused or wondering where their point of entry is and how they access the services.
You mentioned the role of the media in the mental health landscape. How can we change?
Well, look, I just want to say I've had a lot of exposure to the media over the last 10 years. I just think the media has been absolutely fabulous for getting mental health on the agenda. I just want to thank everyone that might be listening that's helped in that process. Journalists understand how important mental health is, and mostly, with maybe one or two exceptions, they played an incredibly constructive role in this process over the last 10 years and helped us to get us where we are. So thank you, a big thank you from me and my colleagues for that. The issue I wanted to touch on was and it's not the media's fault, the media are actually more sensible about this, but the mental health field have actually given the journalists the wrong steer on suicide reporting. They've emphasised, and in a way it's justified, the risks involved in certain types of reporting, and that's been a success to do that, so credit to people who have done that. But they've been obsessed with the risks of reporting rather than the opportunities that come from a different type of reporting and a more open and honest reporting of what needs to be said, so that people understand the scale of the problem and how important it is, how preventable it is, and how damaging, coming back to John's point. It's the reason I got so passionate about suicide prevention about 15 years ago is because I used to meet on Saturday mornings with a group of bereaved parents who were massively isolated as parents. They'd lost their kids. They didn't get the same support as kids parents who'd lost their kids in road accidents and other forms of death. They were stigmatised and shamed almost by the society. And the way the media has been inhibited from covering this issue by some of my colleagues in mental health has actually added to the problem and increased the sense of stigma and shame. So we've got to break through that. And I talked to John recently about this issue, and there's nothing to be gained by covering it up. Obviously, you don't want to produce contagion, and there are a couple of things that the reporting can add to that, but that's been exaggerated greatly in contrast to the opportunities in reducing risk from bringing this issue right into the front of people's minds and doing preventive things.
And if I could just comment on that as well, Nick, in most, or pretty well all mainstream media reporting, there's always a reference at the end about how you might get support if the article's created trouble. So people know that it's a suicide. Anybody reading it is aware of that. And it just seems odd to me that we don't come out and call it for what it is. Then that, I guess, frees people up to talk more openly and transparently about the extent and nature of the problem and direct it to some of the solutions. The other issue in it is that, it's often said that there oughtn't be that frank reporting of it because of the risk of contagion or whatever it might be. But most of our community, this probably isn't the environment to acknowledge this, but most of our community is getting their news from something other than mainstream media. It's coming through their Facebook feed or their Instagram thing, or Facebook pages set up in memory of somebody. So it's being talked about in that context, and that is a very often, sometimes sophisticated, but often an unsophisticated, unmonitored, unsupervised environment where the risks associated with that, I think, are significant. And you, in my view, need to front-end this discussion through the mainstream media so that when articles or information is then shared through other social media outlets, it's good quality information and it's the best information available, rather than it being dominated by anecdotes and misinformation from often well-intended people, but it's just wrong. And I think the other part of it, and this is much more contentious, and that is about, you shouldn't be publishing the means by which people commit suicide, and I agree with that, but you do need to find some way of communicating with at-risk groups, and parents are a good example of this. If there's a particular telltale sign that arises from a method that is used, then I'd probably want a group of parents, or I as a parent would want to know that that's a risk. Now, that's much more challenging and much more difficult, but I don't think that's a reason not to have a discussion about it and work out whether there are better ways we can, or more effective ways we can communicate risk information to interested groups within our community.